Hey all you whiskey fans, today we're here to talk about peated whiskey. What is peated whiskey, how does it get peated, and what are some, let's say, tricky ways marketing is kind of trying to influence you into what is a smoky or a not smoky whiskey. There's a little bit of information here to unpack, so let's grab a glass and dive into it. Now, I'm sure you're already aware, there's a lot of whiskey out there, and there's a lot of whiskey doing things like right on the bottle saying medium peated, or XYZ parts per million are in this bottle. And what does this all mean? So before we explain parts per million, let's jump a little bit into what is peated whiskey. Peated whiskey usually comes from Scotland. There are now other parts of the world trying to duplicate or peating malt for sales and making smoky or malted whiskey, but that's not to say it's exactly the same. So as far as the topic and conversation today, we're just going to cover Scotch whiskey. Now, in the Isles, this is the region of Scotland which is kind of like the islands which are way over to the west side of Scotland. There is not a lot of trees, and this means that the inhabitants there have to come up with creative ways to start fires, to create heat. Just so you know, you need to heat up the grain at one point to prepare it to be mashed and to be turned into whiskey later. Now, during this process, again, there's no trees to cut down, no firewood to use. We're talking about old traditional ways of making whiskey here. They use peat. And peat, it just so happens, gives off that aroma, that smoky, earthy, sometimes medicinal aromas that we kind of like in whiskeys. It's not to say that all whiskey should have this aroma and there's not ever too much or too little of it for a whiskey, but it's very interesting, another layer of complexity that many distilleries around the world now play around with. So, parts per million. What parts per million is trying to calculate is how many parts per million of this peat, when it's heated up, actually attaches itself and holds on to the malted barley. So during this malting process, when they use peat to heat up and to stop this malting, making the grain ready to be distilled, what happens is they end up with these different phenols. These phenols are produced when you heat up the peat that essentially burns up, and parts of the peated or the smoke actually attach themselves and become one with the grain. These are the phenols. This is what we're calculating with parts per million. However, and this is where it gets interesting, PPM, or the parts per million, are not to be confused with smoky or not smoky. The reason for this is it's not always very clear, and the distilling process influences and plays a huge role on how much of these phenols actually end up in the finished product or whiskey, and how many of them just kind of fade away or, let's say, become less impactful throughout the distillation. I really want to put emphasis on this because there's a lot of whiskey hunters out there looking for whiskeys, looking for peated Scotch whiskeys, and using the PPM as a way to understand, okay, is this the flavor profile that I'm looking for? Is this what I want? It probably isn't. Let's explain. There are two major things that in my mind play an impact on this. First, PPM, we are measuring the phenols on the grain. Okay. I don't know if this is well-known information or not. I definitely didn't know this when I started distilling. Peated whiskey is only a small fraction of your mash bill. You might use anywhere from 10 to 40% peated malt. The rest of that, whatever, 90 or 60%, is just regular malted barley. That's not to say this is good or bad. The overall process will play a huge role in how this whiskey ends up tasting and actually being. But even if the parts per million are huge on the bottle, don't imagine that they're going to be using enough grain or that the ratio of grain is always going to be the same so that they're going to have that much peat or that much smoke at the very end of the distillation. That's not always the case. Now, a good example of this is an Ardbeg that you love. What's interesting with Ardbeg is usually their peated grain is 50 plus minus ppms. 50 doesn't sound like a lot. Again, there's a lot of whiskey out there with a lot more PPMs in there. So how can this be? And why is it less or more smoky? Now, there's a book out there. I don't know if you all have a chance to pick this up or find a version of it, but this is a book by Matt Strickland. And Matt Strickland is an amazing distiller. He's now running a little distillery in Quebec, Canada, but he's also worked at distilleries in the US, in Tennessee, and he has a very rich and very colorful past, and I mean this is a compliment, in distilling. One thing that he's done is put him into two great books that if you are thinking about distilling, I heavily recommend, because the amount of information and knowledge in here you almost cannot compare to. He has a section in his book, and if you have the batch distilling, this is page number 93, you here get an idea of how a distillery produces and kind of follows the different processes from their wash ABV, this is their mash, this is how much percentage alcohol they produce after fermentation. You have your low wines collection point. And for an idea, low wines is another way to see your first distillation. The reason for this being, you usually do not get a very high amount of alcohol off a pot still. Now, if you are in the Americas or using a column still, you might only need one distillation, but that one distillation is going to give you much more ABV. As you can see here, we don't really have an exact calculation or an exact number of kind of the amount of alcohol that's being kept or used. What's really interesting is you start to see how long the heads cut is. For instance, with Ardbeg, they only wait 10 minutes of their distillation before making the heads cut. Now again, you cannot take all of these values just at base, because what's also important here is that we don't know the temperatures that they're running at, the still sizes, the swan neck angles. I mean, we know a lot of this, but all of this plays a huge role, and I'm not going to dive into that here. Now, the spirit cut, the second to last column here, is what you would consider their hearts. They're really clean cuts, almost flavorless, but high pure of alcohol, ethanol alcohol. In my mind, of course, these are all very smoky whiskeys, very peaty whiskeys, but it's really interesting to see how low they go in their cuts. So their spirit cut, ending off at about 62 for the Ardbeg and even 59 for the Lagavulin, really speak a lot to how much of the tails are actually being collected after the distillation. The tails are very interesting because the tails are actually where you start to get a lot of the smoky, peaty character. So, why am I telling you this? If you have a lot of PPMs in your grain, in your mash bill, you advertise it, it's all over your bottle, and you're targeting people which love a smoky, rich whiskey. Great. But then you only use about 10 or 20% of this peat in your ultimate mash bill, and you distill it, taking a lot of heads and just a lot of hearts and not a lot of tails. Well, what ends up happening is you're going to lose out on a lot of that smoky whiskey. So you have to really be careful. PPMs are written everywhere. We talk about it everywhere. Some distilleries brag about it. And really, I mean, this one here just says medium peat, but you get the idea. These things might influence you, or they try to influence a buyer when you're looking and staring at a bottle. But do not be fooled. That is not always a good indication of what is or is not a smoky whiskey. The only way to really know is to get your hands on a glass and give it a shot. With that, I'm going to dive into mine here. Cheers to you and your next PPM, high, low, medium whiskey. Whatever it is, think about it and try to figure out, hey, did the label really tell you or give you a good explanation of what the whiskey tastes like? Think about it. Cheers to you and your next glass of whiskey. Bye now.